Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Erasmus Expeditions. I am here tonight with episode 38 of the Help Action series. This is a show where I bring on a guest and we discuss a specific topic relating to RPGs. And we do a little bit of an interview, a little bit of topic discussion, and take some questions from you guys, the audience, and do our best to answer them. And I'm very excited tonight because this is a topic that is very, very near and dear to my heart. Anybody who has watched any of the games that I run here on the channel would know that I love working real world histories and cultures into my games. It's something that I've been doing for years now and have, I'm never going back. I enjoy it a lot. So we're here to discuss history and culture. And I'm very excited to welcome a longtime friend of mine, though I have not been able to see you in person in some time. Mark, you son of a bitch, how are you?
Doing good. How are you doing, Jeremy?
I'm doing good. I'm busy right now, but work is kind of kicking my ass, and I've got a lot going on with stuff on the channel, but we're getting there. What do you got going on? Anything? Uh-oh. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. You broke up for a second.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah. Well, there hadn't been a lot of gaming so much. Actually, I did. Our group, our first dish group, has done some Zoom, so we've been doing a little bit of that. So really, that's pretty much all I've been playing. So, yeah, that's about it for role playing right now.
Yeah. Well, hey, role playing is just kind of one of those things. It's kind of like sex. Even if you're just getting a little bit, it's okay. Like it's better than none, right? So, yeah, you and I have known each other for a long time. I was trying to think back to whenever it was that we first started playing together, but I don't remember when. It had to have been in the mid to late 90s.
Oh, I would say probably somewhere around 2000, maybe.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah, started the third edition game. So, yeah, I'd say it's about 2000-ish.
Well, before that, we started playing the first edition group, I'm pretty sure.
Did we?
Was it that long ago? We were playing at Clyde's house for a long, long time.
Okay, so it may be even further back than I realized.
Yeah. Which is really cool. I like having that kind of, well, not to put too fine a point on it, but that kind of history with people, especially whenever it revolves around gaming. One of the things that I like to try to sneak in near the top of the episode is when and how did you find gaming? How did you get into this weird, wacky hobby that we have?
Oh, wow. It was a long time ago. It was probably about 13 or so. And it was in the interesting thing. I was involved in the scouting program. And one of the scout leaders had discovered Dungeons & Dragons. And so it was kind of funny. After the merit badge class, it was like first aid or something, some of us decided to go and join a game he was running on Saturday afternoon. And that was my first exposure. And I never experienced anything like that, right? I mean, this is even before you really had computer role-playing games were a thing. And so, yeah, it seemed strangely just kind of magical, this thing, what was going to happen. And we did the Caves of Chaos, the Keep on the Borderlands. And so, going and facing the kobolds, and they were such, these strange creatures, So, yeah.
Yeah, it actually mirrors my own story, my own introduction to RPGs pretty similarly, because Scott, who was my scoutmaster at the time, is the one who formally taught me how to play. He was the first person that I sat down with the rule books with, and actual dice and things. So he was my first real introduction into the hobby, and it was while we were on a scout trip, on a scout outing. So it's funny that we have we have a kind of similar approach to kind of our introduction into the hobby.
Well, the interesting thing is, Scott got introduced to the game too, in that group that, where I just, first started playing. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. And, I liked playing so much that I guess I impressed that upon Scott at one point or another. And whenever you guys started playing again, he invited me to come to y'all's game, and I played for you guys, or with you guys, for a number of years. It's just funny that it's kind of a small world, I guess, in that way. But yeah, I've always felt like that magic that you're talking about with RPGs, the fact that anything was possible, right? That it was unlike reading a book, it was unlike watching a movie, it was unlike even playing a video game. You had so much more direct input into what was going on, and the experience that you lived through in the game was so much more profound. It had the capability of moving you emotionally in ways that I hadn't been moved before by media. So I definitely understood the draw pretty early on. But when I started playing in college with a group of people who were all theater and drama majors, then I really understood like the massive spectrum of experience that you can have with the same set of rules, with the same game. And then I really understood how incredible the potential was for this kind of storytelling. And I was hooked from that point on, for sure. Let's see. So the legends and the lessons that history contain they're invaluable to us. It's so that we don't have to continue to make the same mistakes and relearn the way of things over and over again, theoretically, at least.
Theoretically, I don't know if it actually works that way, though.
Right, that's what they keep telling us, at least. But I think whether it's an oral history of our own culture, or it's a written account of a place that no longer exists, there's always something that can be gleaned from a deeper understanding of where we've been as a collective species, again, in practice. But how is it that we can utilize those same legends and lessons at the gaming table?
Well, I think that one of the things you can do is give your game depth, right? You can actually have an actual cultural framework, a setting, just even little things like customs and festivals. Like we've had game sessions around festivals, and so drawing upon these little historical elements, I think makes your world feel a little more real to your players. It also can feed additional stories, and hooks that your players can grab onto. So yeah, I think that's a lot of it.
Yeah, I agree. It gives you something to do other than just always having combat, for one. It's a way for your players and their characters, more importantly, to interact with your world and experience what it has to offer other than just villains and monsters to fight. It's a great way to introduce, like you said, a living, breathing world to interact with.
Mm-hmm. I think so. Also, another thing, though, too, is by using a historic world. I mean, it's great to create a completely imaginary world with completely imaginary civilizations you know, and that's great. But on the other hand, though, players, if it's too alien, they may not be able to identify with it very well. Whereas a historical culture, people at least have some idea of what it is. You know, if I described a group of people approaching, and you know they were wearing, you know, some wearing horned helmets, for instance. Vikings didn't necessarily really wear horned helmets, but you know, and they're wearing mail armor trimmed with fur, and they have axes and swords, and they have, you know, blonde and red beards. People are gonna think, oh, those are Vikings, and then that opens up a lot more information for them, you know, as opposed to, you know, just some random group of guys, you know, who are kind of nondescript.
I couldn't agree more. It's we talk a lot on the show here about utilizing cliches and tropes. That those aren't a bad thing to lean into. Use that, because what that is it creates that shorthand between you and your players. It gives you the ability to get across a certain bundle of information very quickly and succinctly for them to then build off of, and not guarantee that you're on the same page, but it establishes a stronger understanding of what's going on. You describe these particular, you know, brigands or whatever that look like Vikings, and all of a sudden there's a lot of understood information. They're probably going to be prone to violence. They're going to be okay with dying. You know, it creates that kind of shorthand, and I think that's something that's invaluable as a dungeon master. The more you can get across with the least amount said, then that's a tool that you need to keep in your belt, in my opinion.
Well, yeah, I mean, and you know, let's say they're a group of Vikings, then you know they probably have a meat hall or something somewhere with, you know, where they, you know, treat meat and eat, you know, boar or whatever, as opposed to maybe another group, you know, that look maybe more Aztec and Mayan. Well, they're going to come from probably a city with, you know, temples and step pyramids and big processional, you know, walkways. And so, yeah, there's so much more information you can just get from that little description that has that cultural tie-in.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, while again, what we talk about a lot on this channel is embracing tropes and cliches, it's also important to use people's expectations of those tropes and cliches to work in your favor. So when you need them to be surprised, that's when you take something about that culture and you change it. So that way, when they see it, they're like, "Oh, I wasn't expecting that." You know, I wasn't expecting the Vikings to have a massive city. You know, I wasn't prepared for that. I was thinking of something different. To keep them guessing, to keep it fresh, I think it's important to be able to include, to be okay with tweaking the cultures and societies that you're basing your game on.
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, at the end of the day, you're not doing a documentary, you're not doing a simulation. So you don't necessarily have to be a faithful reproduction of history. The simple fact is, I mean, especially the further back in history you go, we don't know everything. Not all societies were literate. Only so much of their writing survived. Sometimes what we know of them is from other people who weren't necessarily their friends. So, like when we did the Midworld campaign, I did Anglo-Saxons. I decided to do Anglo-Saxons, like pre-Christian Anglo-Saxons, because they were a little different than Vikings, but they only had a limited amount of information about them. So definitely trying to piece together information about them, try to kind of was maybe a little more harder than a more better documented, you know, society.
Absolutely. But also, like, at least for me, and I'm kind of a little bit of a world builder just by my nature. It's a part of the hobby that I really enjoy putting time and effort into. And so for me, when I see those gaps, that's a chance for me to fill it in with something of my own, to take a little bit of artistic license and oftentimes that's the elements that I use to push it back in the direction of being clearly Dungeons and Dragons. So, you know, a lot of the stuff, the cultures and histories, they obviously have magic and monsters and things woven into their mythology and their folklore, but not into their history, obviously. So when there's a gap there, that's usually when I'll say, okay, maybe this, you know, creature of this lake that they kind of only briefly mentioned, maybe that could be a hag, even though hags aren't a part of, you know, whatever this folklore is. Maybe I could twist a hag and make it fit the aesthetics and the belief structure or whatever that I already have established with this culture. That's the kind of thing that I'm always on the lookout for as a campaign designer or world builder.
Well, yeah, I think, you know, there's going to be gaps, you know, and just kind of like in Jurassic Park where they filled in the gaps of the DNA with the frog DNA. You kind of almost have to do that, you know, with some of these older cultures.
I know, DNA.
Like I said, with, you know, the Anglo-Saxon culture I mentioned was, I mean, that was the Dark Ages. I mean, literally people forgot how to write in Britain for a period of time. That's not a good situation to document, you know, a culture and so on. But like I said, it does not have to be 100% accurate, because it can't be with some of these cultures.
Yeah, I agree. And that actually leads us to one of our preloaded questions a little bit. We actually have two questions, and they're very similar in kind of what they're asking. So I'm going to read both of them, and then we can kind of approach it with an answer. So the first one is from Gwen Reed, and she asks, when using real-world cultures and histories as a setting, how do y'all depict or not depict those times that were very obviously not great for certain people of a different race, different gender, sexuality, etc., without making the whole thing a drag for people who have modern sensibilities? The second question, somewhat similar, is from Lloyd Collins, and he asks, how are you mindful of looking at our history and not lionizing elements that we would now consider to be, at a minimum, problematic? Things like I don't know this word, pederasty in ancient Greece. It must be, yeah, having sex with kids. Anti-Semitism in everywhere, slavery in the States, etc. How do you approach playing a character or running a game in these settings, fitting into these settings without endorsing the things that were normal in those cultures and times?
Actually, I've had a little bit of difficulty with some of this, because obviously most people today are hopefully uncomfortable with the idea of human slavery. But a lot of ancient cultures practiced slavery. So you can either go two routes, right? You can just say, well, they just don't do slavery. You know, their values are in some ways more like ours. And that's okay. If that makes your players are more comfortable with that, then that's perfectly fine. But on the other hand, though, you can look at it like once again, if you're going to do like a Viking society or whatever, slavery did exist. And actually, that was some of their motivation for going out and pillaging and, you know, raiding. Part of that was to get slaves. So I think if your players are comfortable with it, I think you can introduce those elements. They add depth to the campaign. Just because they're there does not mean that you necessarily endorse them. I mean, think about like the series Vikings. They're capturing slaves. You know, they did really horrible things to them. So I think either you basically have to admit those elements, or you kind of got to face them head on and be a little bit honest about what they are, not kind of whitewash them. It just depends on which approach your players are more comfortable with.
Yeah, I would agree with that for the most part. I think it's definitely a matter of what people are comfortable with at the table. And more importantly, I think it's better if you're going to include those kinds of problematic elements that um, you don't champion them. You don't romanticize those aspects of the game. Uh, for me personally, at least, when I include those kinds of things in my games, if I'm going to, I like to paint them in a light from my modern sensibilities. So, the people who are practicing slavery, the slavers that are in my game, most of the time, the heroes are fighting those people. They're stopping them from taking slaves. Um, I prefer to kind of live that fantasy, if you will, of fighting the evils of the day, even if they were normal. Um, and I think that it's okay to include those things as long as there's a discussion up front, and like you said, everybody's honest about the way they feel about it, and you're honest about what it's going to represent in the game. Um, yeah, I think it's okay to include those things. Um, but on the other hand, too, sorry, go ahead.
It's not necessarily, some of these things are not easy topics to handle. But it really depends on how authentic you want your society to be. I mean, some of these societies, there were things that were not pleasant by our standards. I mean, slavery, human sacrifice, I mean, a number of things. So, yeah, I mean, do you think that a little bit of authenticity is will add something to the game, and will it be something your players are okay with?
Yeah,
I think if you approach it kind of a mature way, and I think it depends on the maturity of your players. I mean, like if I was playing with children, I would not introduce that kind of stuff. I would keep it much, happier and, light. But if you're playing with adults, um, that's a different circumstance.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of times too, like one of the campaigns that I'm currently preparing for takes place kind of in a Baroque, like Spain, France, Venice kind of culture, and much like many time periods in cultures across the world, women were not treated very well. And I have female players in that game, and we had to have a discussion about what the roles of women in that society are going to look like, if they're going to be more like it actually was in history, or if there was going to be more of a loose interpretation of that within my version that's based on those cultures. If that makes sense. And it was a very easy decision to make, where for me, just toss out as much of that problem as there was, because I don't want the players in my game to feel like they're limited in what their characters can do. If they want to be a fighter who's a woman and be a musketeer type character, I want that to be an option. And I think part of that is going into are your characters okay? Are your players okay with it? Where is their comfort level? But I think it's a good conversation to broach before you ever really start rolling dice, so that people are kind of aware of what they might be getting into.
Well, I think part of it, yeah, it's how well you know your players. Like a lot of people I've known for a long time. I got some feeling for what for them, but yeah. And the topic of women, I mean, yes, in medieval society, women did not play roles of a combatant role or whatever. But so yeah, I generally tend to kind of fudge a little bit around that women can maybe take a little more active role, especially with female players. I mean, they're going to want to be fighters or whatever. So Yeah, I think you have to. Yeah, you do have to make some allowance for that. I've heard of games though, like there's a Pendragon role playing game, which is set in Arthurian England, right? And if you're trying to play that setting, the knights are men, the ladies are the court, and courtly love, and and so on. If you've got something that specific, it might be kind of hard to do that. But as a general scenario, and the way I've always played is that I do not limit the role of my players based on cultural the cultural norms of that time, because once again, yes, we're not doing a simulation. And also too, if you look at ancient history, right, like the Celts, the Norse, Bronze Age peoples, there are indications that we find women buried with weapons. So there were indications that women did have these martial roles in ancient history. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I love about using history is that if you really do go back and look at the history, do some research, read, some of the shit that you don't know is incredibly fascinating. The things that people have already thought of, that have already accomplished and already done, and it's been forgotten about because it happened such a long time ago. It's just incredible. The things that we think we understand about one particular culture because of the way we've been taught, or like you said, we've read an account that was written by someone who lived 150 years ago and didn't really care for their culture. That's one understanding of a culture, and it's usually misguided. But when you really start to kind of deep dive in your research, it's fascinating to me how much interesting tidbits that you can find all throughout history. The kinds of people that lived, the things that they did. I was reading the biography of Casanova the other day on, again, Wikipedia. It's not like the end all be all, but it's good enough for me. The life that the man that was Casanova lived was incredible. Like the things that he did in one lifetime are just astounding, nothing short of astounding. And to think that now Casanova's, it's really just a name associated with being a womanizer, and there's not really much else. There's not really much connotation that comes across in that. But to read about this entire life that was led and how unconventional it really was, even for its time, is informative, and I don't know. I can't think of a better word than fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, people in earlier times, they were different. I mean, the times were generally more violent. They perhaps had different values and things they emphasized, like honor. I mean, people would die for honor. But, getting back to the point you were talking about, Casanova and what we think of today, a lot of people's perceptions, I do think, also come from movies and books that sometimes can be very superficial sometimes. And also, too, I mean, you also have people's built-in prejudices, right? Like I referred to, ancient tombs containing, signs of female warriors. Well, in the 19th century, scientists could not imagine women being warriors. Women were, I don't know, supposed to hold parasols, I guess, and I don't know, whatever. But and so they dismissed the evidence that was right in front of their eyes. They said, well, really wasn't a warrior. They just put weapons, in for whatever reason, or they basically danced around the truth, what their own eyes told them.
Yeah, it's funny. And I think that's a pretty apt thing that we even see happening today, that people take a bundle of facts that are presented to them, and they put them through a filter of, and that's normal, everybody does that, but to then just hear what you want to hear, or just find the evidence that supports your existing worldview and disregard or throw away everything else, that's a problem that humans seem to have. And I think you're right. I think that when these histories were being recorded better, a lot of the interpretations were, well, again, we're seeing it through somebody else's filter. We're seeing it through their own prejudices, their own interpretation of things, and we don't know what they discarded, what they decided to not write about, or what they decided to change the facts of. And I think we're getting to the point now as a society, especially, where information is so freely available that while you can't always trust the information that you're getting for the same kinds of reasons, that there's an abundance of material that you can kind of sift through and figure out what makes sense to you, instead of just having to take someone's word for it. And hopefully, if things continue on that trajectory, we'll arrive at something closer to there being a recorded truth throughout history.
Yeah, but yes, you've always got to be kind of a little suspicious of your sources and stuff. But yeah, I mean, the internet is like one of the best tools. I mean, I will, will get a book. Like you may, if you can really see in the back, I've got a couple books on Anglo-Saxon culture, which I got for my Midworld campaign to because the internet is good, but sometimes a book is going to be a little deeper, a little more thorough. But two, I mean, to cover elements that were missing, like the religion, yes, of ancient Anglo-Saxons were very similar to the Norse, but it wasn't exactly the same. So I went and looked at more modern sources, like modern pagans and some of their beliefs. And yes, they too are in the situation where they're having to kind of stitch together, because there is not many records surviving. I mean, there was not a lot of incentive for the people who wrote about things, Christian monks, to dutifully, record pagan practices. So sometimes you just have to kind of stitch things together as best you can.
Yeah. And to me, that's part of the fun of it, because again, that's the places where I can change things freely, in order to make it better fit. Because again, I don't run historically accurate games. I run historically inspired games. I find a culture that I like things about, and I say, oh, okay, I think I know how to tell a story within this kind of culture. I think I understand the way the lore and the mythology and all of that kind of works, as far as heroes and monsters and all of that kind of stuff. And then I look for the ways that I can change it from being a historically accurate representation, because if you're going to really, really research a specific culture, that is for some people, it's a lifelong commitment to study. And if you're only running, a campaign that's going to last a year and a half, I don't want to devote 5 years of my life, fully researching a culture. So I'm going to find the Wikipedia article, or a recommended book, or an audiobook, or my personal preference, because I do watch a lot of film, is I get every movie and television series and things that I can think of that takes place in that setting or culture or genre, and I watch it all, and I try to soak up as much as I can as far as what are the common elements, what or the terminology that's used frequently, the places that they're talking about over and over again, the kinds of ways that they tell stories, what's important to their culture. And those are the things that I will take away and then go do a little bit more research on and look for ways to then put it into my campaign or build around it. So yeah, I like doing that. I think it's a fun part of building my campaigns.
Yeah, I think there's degrees of, authentic you want to get it, right? But yeah, you don't need to go overboard on it, because at the end of the day, you are creating essentially a game setting. But still, knowing a little bit about how a society's religion, its culture, how it governed itself, how it worked economically. I mean, where it was, was a society where you had, serfs, following a lord of a manor, or was it, a god king with, subjects, or so yeah.
One of the other questions that we have is kind of talking and dancing around this subject that we've been kind of talking about. And the question comes from DBJ, and he asks, how do you deal with the, well, actually syndrome? Many players are armchair or sometimes even degree-carrying historians. How do you insert these changes and these exceptions and oddities to generally well-known facts, maybe even? The one that comes to mind, he says, for him are women in combat, which we've already discussed. Another are minorities in power, or literary and sciences that we take for granted, but might not have been in existence back then.
Well, it is a game. So, I mean, I don't know if we have to, if you have someone, I don't know, they're actually graduate student in history. Yeah, you're probably not going to, make them completely happy with the absolute fidelity of your campaign and, setting in regards to that culture. But I think, as long as your players understand that, I mean, I think everyone understands it's a game, and just like in a movie, you're probably going to forgive a few strokes where they, kind of maybe brush over some of the details or present things a little different way. And, in a sense, it's a basic degree of artistic license. So yeah, I mean, as far as like just anachronisms, I mean, you can basically, role players just don't have access to information. It's like a very obvious one is like, well, your players just can't suddenly, discover gunpowder and arm the whole party with gunpowder. I mean, if it was that easy, it would have been done a long time ago. And your player may be somewhat exceptional, but they're not that exceptional.
Yeah, I would have to agree. And like Nico brought up in the chat, and that's the kind of stuff that you would normally cover in a session 0. That kind of the hedging of expectations of kind of what is acceptable, where we're kind of placing this in history, technology, etc. But I like the analogy that you made between the forgiveness that we have as an audience for certain things in movies, that what we call a willing suspension of disbelief. Like when you sit down, you're willingly suspending your disbelief in what you're about to watch. That's kind of the contract, if you will, that you sign as an audience member when you sit down to consume a piece of media. It's that what my wife and I like to say whenever we sit down to watch a stupid action movie, we're going to turn our brains off because we're not going to analyze it too much. We're just going to be here for the huge, massive explosions and the silly one-liners, because that is okay to consume that kind of media and enjoy that. There's nothing wrong with that. Just like having an RPG that you play that is the same thing. That is the kick down the doors, kill the monsters, get the loot, power up, move on to the next room. That's okay. There's okay to play that kind of game and enjoy that kind of game. But I think that for me, that it's the same kind of audience creator trust is that willing suspension of disbelief. Like when you're going to play in a game, you have to be able to accept a certain level of suspension of your disbelief. I'm not going to overanalyze this, from the player's point of view. And as far as using things that might be well known and not knowing it or changing it, to me, it's the same thing as like running a Star Wars game. And the people that get real butthurt about things that you don't get canonically right, it's kind of like, look, man, like, for one, there's an entire warehouse full of information that I cannot expect it to know all of. I'm glad that you know more than I do. That's awesome. But stop being a dick. Like, it doesn't matter that I said the wrong color for the, the hut of Jabba or whatever. Who cares? Like, that's not the focus. Let's move on. And I think most people are probably not going to drag that kind of a conversation out, but you never know. There's all kinds of people out there.
Yeah, that would always make the argument of doing the completely made up civilization. It's like, how do you know they're made up? How do you know how they're supposed to do something? But
exactly.
I think that was kind of nice, though. If you kind of pick a society in history or wherever you're kind of very interested in, you learn more about it. And the prime objective, of course, is to have fun and play the game. But your players can also pick up, some stuff that they maybe didn't know before in the process of playing.
100%. I love that as a player. Running, a character in somebody's game, and they do something that's really cool, and I'm talking to them about it later. I'm like, hey, that was a really neat encounter, or man, where did that monster come from? And they tell me, oh, that's actually a thing from mythology or from such and such folklore. I'm like, okay, and I go straight to the internet, and I'm like, yeah, I want to look it up, and I want to know more. I think that's one of the really awesome parts about this hobby is learning history in school was never exciting for me. The way that it was taught, the way it was presented was incredibly dry. And I could not engage with that. But having graduated, of course, being done with schooling in my adult life, I have discovered a love for history through my love for playing Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, I guess I'm a little bit more of a history nerd. I actually had a professor in college try to convince me to become a history professor. I didn't follow that route. I followed a different route. But I still like reading about history and learning about these things, and just the value too. I mean, knowing the past really does help you understand what's happening today. Little things that happen now, if you understand why they're happening, you understand when they become a big news story tomorrow.
Yeah, I would have to agree again. That is becoming something that I am increasingly more aware of year after year. I'm looking around going, why does nobody realize what's going on here? Like, why does nobody see these benchmarks that are being hit, that have been hit, half a dozen times in recorded recent history, and we're watching them all happen again, but nobody's alarmed. What's going on? And part of that is just the fact that I'm becoming a cynical old bastard in my old age. But, that's just kind of the way it goes. We have a question I'm going to go ahead and get to. Brent has asked this quite a while ago. How much lore do you start with? I'm guessing he's asking like when you decide to begin a story in a particular culture.
Okay. I mean, as far as like telling players, or
maybe both. Like, how much do you prepare for yourself as a dungeon master, and then how much do you give the players ahead of time to not overwhelm them, perhaps?
Okay, I would say, and not all of my campaigns are deeply historically based. I mean, I've done some campaigns that are just kind of more generic or whatever. But as a general rule, I do like having that historic background. I think it does make things easier. As far as the lore, some of it I might be already familiar with. Some of it I might, especially if it's going to be like a campaign that's going to last a while, I will, do some research on the internet. Maybe read a couple books on this subject. Get familiar with the religion, some of the history, how that society ran on a day-to-day basis. As far as the players, I think it's better to kind of give them a general idea of what kind of culture they're starting in, but then kind of introduce them to it a bit at a time, right? Like, for instance, I didn't throw at the group a calendar of all the holidays. No, it just came that time of year. There was a festival, and it celebrated the festival. So I think it's better to just as is at appropriate times use that information, but don't just dump it on your players at one time. I mean, it probably would just be overwhelming, and honestly, they're not going to remember all of it if you just kind of throw it all at them.
Yeah, if they're going to read it all in the first place, it can be a very daunting thing to be expecting to sit down and play a game and have your character rolled up in dice and be handed a 20-page dissertation about the campaign setting.
Basically, I think they need a basic background so they know where they're coming from. Especially if you want to be a little grounded in the world, like I don't know, they're a son of a Thane or whatever. Maybe give them a mention of some deities, especially if they're a more religious type class. But yeah, you don't have to. Yeah, a 10, 20 page information dump is not really going to help them much.
And I think your approach is absolutely the right way to handle it. It's the show, not tell. If you're having to explain all of this, that's really, to me, like learning history was in school. It's very dry, and I'm not going to retain much of it. But if you let me interact with it, if you show me that this is the way things are in your world, I'm going to have an entirely different level of investment. And I think that for me, I'm the same way. Like when I decide that I'm going to run a game and use a specific culture as an influence, I decide how much of an influence it's going to be. If I'm just kind of vaguely giving this a Middle Eastern flair, and I'm not going to dive too far into the politics, the religions, and things like that, because I have some of that already established or planned, then I might not take a huge deep dive into it. But if I'm leaning heavy into that culture as a basis, then I'll consume as much as I can ahead of time, for the same reasons that I mentioned. I made a video on the channel a while back called Steeping, where I discussed this particular approach, I guess you want to call it, where I do just watch movies and read comic books if I can find them, audiobooks and whatnot, so that I can become familiar with that form of storytelling, when I can steep myself into the culture that I'm using as a basis. But I don't expect my players to approach the game with that same level of fervor. That's impossible to ask of someone, I think. So I think giving them a little bit so that they understand kind of what kind of a character they should be creating and how they might be fitting into that world. I think that kind of stuff is important up front. But yeah, you don't want to drown that information.
I think that falls more on the dungeon master. I mean, you're creating a world, and it's part of your world building. Your players will learn it over time, but yeah, the more of trying to flesh out all that stuff is definitely falling more on the dungeon master.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, something I've said before on the show is nobody is ever going to be as stoked or amped for your campaign as you are. That's just the way that it is as a creator. So you can't expect everybody to have the same level of involvement, especially in the beginning, as you might whenever you're coming into this. And I think easing into it is a better way. So hopefully that answers your question, Brent. We'll roll right into a question here from Nico. He asks, do you ever feel intimidated enough by the history of a setting that you hesitate in joining the game as a player or maybe even running?
Well, I don't run like pre-made settings. Like I've never run like a Greyhawk or Forgotten Realms. And just reading a little bit on them and just all the stuff that's been out about them, I could see how people might find that intimidating, jump into those settings. And also, too, you do have well, that's the canonical, that's not how it's supposed to happen because, over in, supplement, whatever, it said it happened this way. So I think definitely, in some sense, it is for me easier and better to create my own settings and bring in these cultures, because really, I mean, bringing in these cultures and history do some of the work for you. And in many ways, I mean, trying to learn all this stuff about an already existing setting with this, very involved, convoluted history. I mean, I almost rather learn about real culture, honestly. But
yeah, that's fair. And in some cases, especially in the case of things like Greyhawk and Forgotten Realms, you're talking about 40, 50 years of real-time history that has been pumped into these settings. So it's definitely a daunting, beast of an undertaking to try to learn all of that. Now, if you've been playing in those and you've kind of learned over the years, then obviously that's going to be something you're more comfortable with running a game in. But yeah, I'm the same way. Like, I don't know a lot about Forgotten Realms. I do know some that I've gleaned from, people that I've known and played with through the years, but I've never run a game in Forgotten Realms.
Yeah, I think too, though, if you base it on history or whatever, the thing is, though, you're not actually doing history, right? Like, if you're going to do the Forgotten Realms, you're actually basically buying into a history, the battle of whatever happened in year whatever. Whereas here, I mean, unless you're setting it into a close analog of world history, like maybe like a parallel Earth that's really close. Just because you based it on medieval England doesn't mean there was a Battle of Hastings. So you can create your own history and canon in a sense inspired by the culture, but you're not kind of locked into a specific history.
Yeah, that's fair. And to answer your question a little more directly, Nico, for me personally, would that kind of thing keep me from playing in a game? More than likely not. But I absolutely would be telling the person running the game and the other people that I'd be playing with that I'm not up to snuff on the history or the canon or whatever. And as long as they were willing to be patient with me and explain things to me as questions came up, then I would have no problem whatsoever sitting at that table and playing.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with you, Jeremy. I don't think it would put me off actually playing. Like I said, I've run my own settings, but as far as playing, it would not put me off. But yes, I may not be the expert on this setting. So, and honestly, if you expect everybody to be an expert on a specific setting, you may not have that many players. So there may only be so many experts out there.
Yeah, in my experience, the people that think that there are experts are pretty much the only people that kind of feel that they're the expert. They're the only ones that are good for the job, in their opinion. Okay, well, we've talked about it a couple of times but having known you for a long time, I already knew how much of a student of history that you were. Can you link this lifelong love of yours back to any single instance or moment in your life?
I think it was. I think it was just kind of a gradual thing. I mean, to a certain degree, I think I grew up with it. I mean, I had a fair number of books. I read a fair number of books as I was a kid. I think I always had a certain interest in history. I think too, my father also contributed to that. One of my actual memories, it may seem kind of an odd memory, but one of my fonder memories of my father was we just spent an afternoon going through encyclopedias, learning about the Hussites and John Huss and learning about all the events that happened around there because we have ancestry from that part of the world, and we decided to dig into it, and we spent an afternoon doing that. And it's actually a very fond memory I have of my father.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's not something that I shared with my father, but when he was a kid, he would read encyclopedias for fun. That was how he spent a lot of his extra time, was just kind of going through them. And when it would mention something that interested him in one article, he would put that down and go, get the one that references that in more detail. And so that's not something we ever did together, but my love of history is now doing that with Wikipedia. So by the end of a time when I've sat down to do a little bit of research, I've got 10 tabs on Wikipedia open because I want to read more about this specific sect of priests that they mentioned, in this other article I was reading. And I try not to fall too far down the rabbit hole because, again, there is such a thing as too much research. But I like to say, okay, I don't have time to really delve into that now, so I'm going to copy this and paste it in a Word document so that I can read it later. And I'll go back and highlight it or pull out the information that's relevant or useful to me in my game prep. So I think it's really cool that that's a moment that not only is a passion of yours, that it's a memory of a passion, but it's also one that's tied to a closeness with your dad. It's really cool that you were able to kind of share that, that love for history. Okay. So let's see. We've kind of talked about this a little bit as well. So I played and ran a lot of games in what we would call a default fantasy setting for years and years. I'd heard about other settings like Al-Qadim and the like, but I'd never gotten the chance to really play in one of them. And then you ran your Midworld campaign, and it was, as we've discussed, heavily inspired by Anglo-Saxon Nordic traditions and culture. And I instantly fell in love with the notion of running and playing in games that were saturated in the flavors of different cultures. What are the benefits and the detriments of basing the games that we play in these real world cultures? What are the pitfalls and the boons of doing this, aside from the things that we've already mentioned?
Okay. I think we've hit a lot of them. I mean, basically, it provides deeper immersion. I mean, it frankly does some of the work for you, right? Because you're not having to create something whole cloth. You've got basically this hook to drag your players in. I mean, everyone knows usually about something about a number of different cultures, right? Maybe not all equally, but and there's the issue with, yes, it will make you, there are things that are uncomfortable, which you may have to deal with. I think, though, there is, there could be some argument made for, though, creating a society or saying whole from kind of whole cloth, create some totally different, unique, in the sense that it might seem a little more mysterious, magical, because the downside is, yes, having those hooks to pull your players in, and yes, they know these things, but on the other hand, they do know these things. So it's in a sense not as much perhaps as a mystery. Especially if you wanted a setting where the person didn't belong to culture. Maybe they like maybe a John Carter of Mars kind of thing, where they get sucked into this, in that case, literally alien, environment. You know, you may not want to neatly plug into existing cultures, right? You may want something where they're really having to learn everything about how that culture works. And if they don't quickly get to understand how that culture works, it could be really bad for them, right? I mean, and who knows? Who they may offend, or which could lead to bad consequences. So,
yeah. And again, one of the things that we talk about a lot on the show is that the conflict is the source of interest in role-playing games. That's what you want. That's what you need. Conflict that can then be dealt with and overcome. So being able to use the culture and the society itself as a source of conflict is, I think that's really smart, and it's a fun way to show, not tell, your players about the setting that you've developed, especially if it's going to be, like you said, a totally foreign, totally alien type civilization or encounter that they're going on. The one that I thought of was the 13th Warrior. When Eben gets thrown in with these Vikings, these raiders, and he can't even speak their language. He has to learn and pay attention and adapt, and that's its own series of challenges within the story that they tell in that book and that movie. So I think that's a really different and unique thing that I don't see a lot of in role-playing games.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, because cultures have totally different values. But one thing too, you got to kind of consider too, though, in some sense, if you go back 500 years or 1,000 years or 2,000 years, yes, people are people, and in some ways they never change. But people were different 500 years ago. People were different 1,000 years ago. In many ways, very different about how they thought. Like for instance, I remember reading about during the 100 Years' War, the French commanders were preparing for battle, and this one commander was kind of like, I don't really think this is a good plan, for fighting the English. But the others were like, honor and glory and all that had to be, So it's this one individual was thinking maybe a little more modern in a sense, but at the end of the day, he went off, he rode off with them, honor, glory, and well, they died. But the thing is, though, glory and honor were more important than death. I don't know if that's a value you'll see in at least the modern Western world to a large degree.
Yeah, that's very true. And I think too, a lot of times, a lot of people get really caught up in, again, the historical accuracy and things, but they forget that what we're playing in these games typically is a romanticized version of whatever we're looking at, wherever we're looking to set the game. If we're playing a pirate game, I don't want to have to constantly be making saving throws against scurvy, even though that's more realistic. That's not interesting to play through. I want to be standing on the yardarm, exchanging, sword blows that are causing sparks to fly. That's what I'm after in a pirate game. I'm not necessarily looking to recreate a historical uh, to recreate a part of history. I want to use that as a setting, as a backdrop, the way that zombies are the backdrop for The Walking Dead. That's not the real story that we're telling. That's just the the backdrop. That's just the dressing that we're using. Um, but I think for me, one of the potential dangers in using real world histories and cultures is, of course, cultural appropriation. Um, and I think the inclusion of a culture that's different than your own culture within your games requires a certain level of responsibility. I think that you need to do some research, like we've talked about, and it really put in earnest effort to understanding the negative stereotypes that come with an understanding of a different culture, so that you can avoid those stereotypes as much as possible. Um, in my opinion, if you're doing this and you deal with the inclusion of this history or this culture from a place of respect and admiration, then I think that you're taking the correct approach.
Well, yeah, I would agree with that to a fair degree. I mean, you don't want to create a parody of a society, and I think if you do your research and 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 really kind of go into it kind of with a respectful um, um, way. Um, I think you get around all those problems. I think though, for instance, though, if you take a real culture and try and turn it into like an antagonist culture, and maybe just show them completely in the negative light, which maybe once again, the victors write history. Maybe sometimes that's what was done was you know the Romans or whatever sometimes didn't always portray cultures in the best light. Though interestingly, sometimes they portrayed them in a very positive light because then that made the victory over them all that more glorious, dependent on the propaganda they were pushing at the time. But I think maybe if you just treat it, you're respectful. Because at the end of the day, I mean, even the experts don't know everything about a culture and how it functioned, especially a culture that existed a long time ago.
Yeah, I would agree. I like the idea that you brought up about making sure and checking it against making certain that it's not a parody, that you're not doing it for laughs, or that you're not doing it specifically to try to draw a negative stereotype from them. I think that if you divorce yourself from that way of thinking, that you're on the right path. Doing your research, learning with, like I said, with a true desire to want to know more. And one of the things that has always fascinated me with the more that I read um, about historical figures and historical places, cultures that I've never gotten a chance to interact with, is, yes, the differences are very exotic and interesting to me. But the thing that I find more profound than any of that is the similarities, the things that haven't changed, um, the sensibilities even that have remained the same through time. To me, when I find those little things, that, like, man, that's crazy. That was 1,500 years ago. How in the world would a person, like, how can I possibly have been thinking the same kind of thing as somebody from that long ago? How could I have the same concerns at all? It's, well, again, just to bring up the same word, fascinating to me to read those kinds of things.
Yeah, I'm sure if you went back 20,000 years ago, you would I mean, yes, you'd have obviously language barriers and all kinds of things, but yeah, you would probably find a lot in common.
Which is wild. It's just wild to think of. And the other thing that I never can quite grasp a hold of firmly is the actual scope and scale of human history, even just recorded human history. Whenever you think about, the United States was founded 200 and some change years ago. We're closer to the founding of the country than we were to when, the Europeans discovered this country or this area of the world. So, from the point when Columbus landed in the Americas to when the United States was formed is a longer period of time than from when the country was formed to now. And it blows my mind to think of that. Because I don't know enough of the history going back to the founding of the country to then comprehend what happened in the 300 years or whatever before that was even happening. And the fact that we know even less of that, it's just so strange to me.
Well, I think, yeah, that's part of, just the epic sweep of history. I mean, that's a good point. I mean, a long series of, empires rising, falling, civilizations rising to heights, and then just utterly collapsing. And the thing is, though, you can introduce that into your games. You can give that broad depth of history of, and you don't have to like throw a detailed chronology at them, but there are hints of ancient civilizations that were there and gone, ruins. I mean, they can be excellent hooks as encountering these ancient civilizations.
Absolutely. If you don't have ruins in your world, you're probably doing something wrong. Like, there needs to be like ruins to be explored. For one, it's a fantastic trope for fantasy RPGs. For two, like you said, it introduces this whole level of a living, breathing history to your world that you don't have to go into a ton of detail about. You don't have to sketch out who these people were, who they were fighting, et cetera, et cetera. All you have to do is just kind of give it a little bit of a description and have like a vague idea of kind of maybe what it represented or what it once was, so that you know what descriptions to give in the different rooms and things. But you don't really need much more than that, because it's only going to be serving a purpose in your game and your narrative for so long.
Well, yeah, I mean, your players are not playing, professors of history. They're not, playing Indiana Jones necessarily. Maybe they will, but not necessarily. So they're not going to be academics with this detailed knowledge of history. They know little bits and pieces of the past. And, the thing is, too, another thing playing on is the misinterpretation of the past, right? Because, people, especially in previous ages, did not have exhaustive educations. They necessarily couldn't even read, or if they could, and they didn't necessarily have books available. So they only knew so much about the past. So, for example, when they found dinosaur bones and bones of ancient mammals, right? They often misinterpreted them. They were the bones of giants who walked the earth, or of dragons, or whatever. And you can play on those elements too, that maybe there is a history as it happened, but your players don't necessarily understand the history as it really happened.
Yeah, it's very much kind of tied to the idea that also gets brought up a lot, of the unreliable narrator. Just because somebody is narrating, what has happened or facts to you, it doesn't necessarily mean that those are true. And that you can use that, you can play against that as a narrative device in storytelling and writing, but you can do that in RPGs as well. The campaign that I ran called White Lotus Black Jade was based in in kind of an Asian themed culture in one of my homebrew worlds. But I asked all of the players to be one of two different clans. They could choose whichever of these clans they wanted to be a part of. I just wanted it to be a rough split kind of down the middle. So they chose. And what I did was our first session with each of those groups was between our session 0 and our first session. Was I took all of the ones from one clan and we met together and played a little short session. And then I met on a different night and with the other group from the other clan and played through a different session. And what that session was they played their ancestors from that clan living through this one moment where they were against one another. Their clans clashed over this one particular item, and they played through their clan's truth of that legend of how this item was lost. And obviously, in each iteration, the other clan was the antagonist. They're the ones to blame for the fact that this powerful artifact was lost. So when we started our actual game, the players came to the table with that feeling of, I understand the truth. I hear what you're saying, but I know the real truth, because in their minds as players, they were there. But in their minds as their characters, their clan has believed this myth for 100 years. So to them, it is the truth. And so there were things about this one instance that were true for both iterations, but there were also a lot of differences. So it was really fun to watch the players try to navigate that as a starting point for their interaction.
Well, I think you make a good point about the unreliable narrator. Because we see it in the world today, propaganda is used. So whatever maybe the empire that your players, live in, they may have, their propaganda about their neighbors and how they present them, and when you actually go out from the empire and encounter these people, they may not be the way they're presented. I mean, sometimes when people have a self-interest to portray people negatively, that's the story that comes out, right? Because it's easier to exploit or take things away from people if they're perceived as some kind of monsters instead of just people. So that's another element you can, that's an element you can tie into your campaign.
Yeah, I agree. That's a very strong narrative device to use, to play that against the expectation. They're told going into it, oh, you don't want to go into the scary dark woods. There's, bad things there, things that will gobble up your children, blah, 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 blah. And then, the players have to go there naturally. You always have to go into the deep, dark forest, and then discover that things are entirely different and they've been lied to. All of a sudden, you have a very multi-tiered kind of story that's going on. Now they can go back and what do? Do they tell the truth? Do they, fight against the people who told them these lies? So yeah, there's a lot of great material to work with that kind of a hook.
Well, with role-playing games, right? A lot of role-playing games have evil as a part of the game. And in many role-playing games, there are definitely things that are evil. I mean, most obvious things, if you have like demons and devils, that would be very obvious, various forms of undead. But yeah, then you have the thing where, well, maybe they're not really so evil, but they're kind of portrayed it because it's, advantageous to do that. Or maybe, maybe they are maybe a little warlike. Maybe they are a tribe where war is important, but that does not make them though necessarily the ultimate evil, though.
Yeah, I agree. Like I said, I think there's a lot of juicy material there in that kind of an arrangement. Playing with expectations. Again, I think that's a strong storytelling element that people could use. And it's one that I don't see a lot of in RPGs, playing against the party's expectations. Okay, we have a couple more questions. Let's get to the one that Nico has asked. Which part of a fictional culture is the hardest to create or imagine whenever doing your own worlds?
I mean, assuming you actually can, well, of course, if it's a purely fictional culture, of course, that gives you a lot of leeway. If you're basing it on history, of course, you're going to have some information easier to find than others. But I would say, in some ways, the big stuff like the deities and who runs the place are the easy part. I think the hard part is kind of getting a feel for the day to day. Like, what is it really like? I mean, yeah, okay, you have King whatever, and yes, you have the mighty Osiris or whatever, but just really giving a genuine feel for how, on a day to day basis, how that society is. How is it like actually walking through a village? How's it like dealing with a typical person in that culture? So I think actually it's really the little details, and trying to work those in a way that's natural and kind of flowing is kind of in some ways maybe the more challenging part of it.
That's cool. That's not something that I had really thought of. For me, a lot of times it depends on if I'm like a lot of the campaigns that I'm running currently are a part of a homebrew world that I've been building for a long time, and running games in for a long time. And I had the idea that different parts of the world were kind of based on different real world cultures or amalgamations of different real world cultures. But I never really treated that with a very heavy hand whenever I ran games. It was always just kind of, yeah, these are the kinds of monsters you might find in this area or whatever. But when I started a few years ago after we played in the midworld, kind of re-examining the different areas of that world. I started to run games that were much more culturally saturated. That I really started looking deeper into the mythology and the cultures and the histories of the cultures I was basing these places on, and trying to bring as much of that over into the setting as I could. Um, it's been eye opening, for one, but also I think for me the hardest part is making sure that I'm still being true or honoring like the things that are established in that world. So like the deities, the pantheon is a prime example. I have a set pantheon, and because of the way clerics and paladins and stuff work, I'd kind of like for that to be universal throughout the world. It's just the interpretations change. So having to kind of sit down and reimagine, I guess, how the pantheon is viewed or what their impact might be on any given culture when I go to run a game in that setting. That's always tough. Might not be the right word, but definitely a daunting undertaking for me.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think though in some way, those if you just focus on what the kings and the gods and the heroes did, you miss out on a lot of a society. But also too, I mean, it depends on how much you're willing to put into it, right? Like if you're using D&D as the basic system, I mean, you can just have fighter, magic user, cleric, or whatever. But if you want to take it a step further, I mean, you can even like create new classes. Maybe a clerical class, which is kind of cleric, but it's not exactly. It fits a little more closely to maybe how that culture operates, and you can take a little license. I mean, like for instance, in standard D&D, right? Kobolds are reptilian dogmen somehow involved with dragons, and they're always evil or nearly always evil or whatever. Well, in the mid-world campaign, I kind of changed that, right? So they were still small, but they were blue, if you remember, because kobold comes from the same root we get cobalt from. And they're a race of miners, and yeah, they could get into mischief, but they weren't these like evil little dragon men. They were more like kind of bluish gnomes. In some ways, it was closer to maybe the original mythology of kobolds and knockers and whatever the various variations were. But at the same time, I kind of also did some things to kind of make them a little more unique too. Because if you go back and look at mythology, wherever, I mean, every region was different. They had different variations. I mean, there is not one absolute goblin or elf or whatever, you know. So I think you can kind of take this stuff and take these elements from myth and then kind of make them your own too.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and I think that that's a good thing to do. Again, you know, kind of lean into the trope, lean into the expectation, and then twist it, change it a bit, make it your own. And that actually leads me to a talking point that I had, where Dungeons and Dragons has a very long history of drawing heavily from real world mythologies. Many of these things have been taken for granted as simply being a part of the game itself, and their origins have kind of been lost on a lot of players. As an example, for a long time, I did not know that golems were actually a part of Jewish mythology, but they've always been one of my favorite monster types. But in your opinion, what what value can be gained from tracing these elements that are borrowed back to their original mythologies?
Well, honestly, I think there's an element of novelty because there have been so much stuff added, and not just D&D, but other elements. And you know, and some of it is they took the stuff and made it their own, right? But if you actually go back in if you go back to more of the original myths and legends, and then kind of base it closer to what they originally were, then they're really kind of different creatures. They may not even have the same motives. They may have the same appearance. They may not have the same powers. Your players may not even immediately recognize what they are. So, you know, for your player that, oh yeah, I know what a kobold is. I got the stats remembered in my head. You know, their die, whatever, and they get, whatever. But then they go and run across, a kobold or goblin that doesn't act like a standard D&D one. Maybe it may be a little more powerful. They may be a little more magical. They don't, like I said, their behavior is different. You may not even recognize what they are at first. And there's even whole new creatures that are in legend that aren't in the monster manual, right? Like I used the red cap. And people aren't familiar with it. It's kind of a gnomish, goblinish type creature that wears a red cap, and basically it murders people and then dyes its cap with their blood. So definitely it was a little bit different, and he was haunting a ruin, and it was a new opponent that people generally weren't familiar with. At least my players weren't at the time, I don't think.
No, I played in that game, and I absolutely was not. I had never heard of a red cap before. And since then, I have gone on to use many of them in my games. I'm currently running an Arthurian-based game that draws pretty heavily from British and German folklore and history, and they fought a red cap in a crypt. As soon as I started designing that encounter, I thought about the time that I fought one in your game. And I was like, man, that was so cool because I'd never heard of one. And then I went and looked online and found out that they are actually a part of mythology. And there's all these really neat things that can be very easily translated into Dungeons and Dragons, mechanically speaking, even, which is always a fun discovery to make for me. Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential with going back and taking something back to its roots with mythology. and again, like in my mind, you're one of the people that showed me the importance in doing that, by specifically running things that I had not encountered before, even though I've been playing D&D for years. It was a really cool experience to see, okay, this is still Dungeons and Dragons, but we've stepped outside of what's written on the page very clearly. But it still feels right. It still fits. Yeah, it's really cool. Okay, we've got one more question here that Nico asked before we even came on the air. How important is it to stick to historical events if you decide to play in a realistic setting? How do you feel when you want to portray or explore a culture that you as a GM don't know that well?
Okay. It kind of depends on how close you're trying to stick to it, right? Like, for instance, if you're doing, an alternate Earth, right, where everything was the same until 1640, let's say, for whatever reason, there was a point where life diverged. That's going to be different than having, it's based on, X culture, but the battles aren't the same, the kings aren't the same. So yeah, it kind of depends. I mean, if you're going to set it on like a parallel Earth, then you're probably going to have to be a little more aware of the specific history, at least up to that point. But I think as far as not being familiar with the culture, I think though if you spend some time learning about it, I mean, spend an afternoon. I mean, just go through Wikipedia and learn some things. I mean, you'll still be better off than if you didn't do anything. You'll be able to present it better than if you didn't. I mean, most movies and books are not held up to a standard of absolute authenticity. And so I at the end of the day, yes, it's nice if if you and your players learn a little bit about history and cultures, but at the end of the day, you are looking for inspiration for your setting and ideas, and you also are looking for basically, you're looking for ideas and inspiration. So yeah.
Yeah, I think my answer would probably be similar. It largely depends on how far you're leaning into that culture or history as a source of inspiration. But I think I would also add that for me, stop before it gets exhaustive for you. Don't burn yourself out trying to deepen your well of knowledge. Like, go as far as you feel as you're interested. Generally, is the litmus test, I guess, that I use. As long as I'm still interested in it, I'm still going to read on it, because I will still find value there that I can store in my notes and possibly use later. But if I find myself getting to the point where I'm no longer interested in the line of succession of these popes for whatever reason, then I'm not gonna keep going. I'm gonna say, okay, I've had enough. That's all I need. And then go back to other things, because you have plenty of other things to do as a dungeon master, that you don't need to dive that far into one type of research.
Well, yeah, I think too, though, like for instance, you know that you're going to run a campaign 6 months from now, right? That's not the same as I'm going to start campaign next week. All right. So starting a campaign next week, that might just be browsing some Wikipedia articles. And there are other sources of information beyond that, but like I remember, like there was something like the Viking Answer Lady or something, and she had a site about Viking culture and so on. But if you've got 6 months, read a little here, read a little there. Yeah, well, but whatever you're comfortable with. I mean, don't turn it into a chore.
Absolutely. And I think too, like, field your players ahead of time. Find out what kind of game they're expecting. Are they wanting something that's more, explorative, where they're going to ruined places of a distant past and poking around in the ruins, or are they wanting more of like a political intrigue story? And then do your research accordingly. Like, if you need to know more about the way courtly life in France worked in the 1600s, because you're going to be playing a political intrigue game that's set in a similar period, then that's where you should spend your time researching.
Well, yeah. And the thing is, though, you don't have to be heavy-handed about it, but definitely, though, giving that sense of atmosphere is very important. I mean, imagine if you had Game of Thrones, right, and set as Westeros in this vaguely medieval atmosphere. I don't know. Imagine instead putting that in modern Philadelphia, and I don't know, they're all fighting in the supermarket, parking lot. I mean, it wouldn't be the same, So setting matters.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think that's, again, that's one of the things I'm a big proponent of are session zeros. Having a session where you sit down and you discuss what the expectations are, what the setting's going to be like, what'll fly, what won't. No, you can't use a gunsmith or whatever the class is called in 5e. They wouldn't a gunslinger. They wouldn't exist in this particular setting. That was one of the things, again, talking about the Baroque themed campaign that I have coming up. We had a discussion as players about, yes, the musketeers and things existed in this time period, so obviously firearms were a part of the stories. Do we want to have firearms included in the setting, or do we want to forego that and just rely on swords and magic instead? And we opted to omit firearms. And even though it's going to be anachronistic, quote unquote, for the game, it leans more in the direction that all of us collectively were looking for the particular story that we're going to be telling with that campaign. So I think having those hedged expectations ahead of time is a really valuable thing.
Well, and I think also too, though, you've got to kind of look at the setting, right? Like, for instance, if you're playing on one-off or you're playing, something very generic, like I remember this guy played like a Minotaur with like an insane amount of templates. Remember third edition, and I mean, it was ridiculous, but it was a one-off, So it's just kind of people were doing crazy, fun stuff. On the other hand, though, if you've basically created this world, it's based on Celtic, maybe Ireland, based on it, not necessarily, actually Ireland. If one of your players say, "Well, I want to play a samurai," I want to play a samurai, it's like, well, no. I mean, when you create those settings like that, yeah, I mean, yeah, you can't just let a player bully you into, compromising, your setting. I mean, you might give a little bit, like, okay, maybe, maybe have a Roman-based player, who, wandered out beyond the boundaries of the empire. But, yeah, so you have to keep at least some integrity to your setting.
I agree. And I'm a big proponent of no not being a dirty word. There's a lot of people that shy away from it being a dungeon master. Oh, you don't ever say no unless it's no and. And I think that that's just not quite true. There are situations where you absolutely need to say no, and it's entirely within your prerogative to do so, as long as you obey the golden rule and you're not being a dick. As long as you're not being a dick, it's okay to tell somebody no. That's called a boundary, and that's okay. Okay, well, Mark, those are all the questions that I have. Those are all the talking points that I wanted to bring to the table. So I think I'm ready to call it an evening. Thank you very much for coming on and having this conversation with me.
All right, well, thank you for having me, and it's good seeing you again, Jeremy.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been too long. I miss you guys, and hopefully, if things get a little better sooner, maybe we can actually get together in person and throw some dice.
Sounds good.
Excellent. Is there anything you want to say? Parting ways with the audience. Anything? Any place you want to let them find you, or anything else?
I was saying, history and culture can definitely enrich your campaign. But at the end of the day, you can't lose sight of having fun with it, and basically using these elements to help create your story, not making them the story.
Yeah, that's a great point. One of the focuses of this series is to showcase that anybody can come to the table and bring something of value with them based on their experiences and their passions, regardless of what it might be. If you look for the ways that those experiences and that knowledge can become an asset and a tool to use at the table, then you're always going to be better off having that kind of utility belt with you, and playing with a large variety of people, which I've been very fortunate to do through my gaming career, has given me, I feel, a very big utility belt to draw from, and do what I want when I'm running a game or when I'm playing in a game. There's still things that I'm learning. There's still tips and tricks and techniques that I'm picking up on, while I'm playing. And my learning, just like with history, isn't going to stop anytime soon, because if you stop learning, then you stop living, in my opinion. So do some research. Teach yourself about somebody from history. It's way more fascinating than you might think it is. I promise. Spend a little bit of time reading. Watch some movies that are set in a different tone or genre or culture than you're used to. God forbid, turn on subtitles and watch a foreign film. See what you can learn that way. Yeah, but Mark, it's been fantastic, man. Thank you so much for coming on and being my guest. Whenever I thought about talking about history and cultures, there was only one person that came to mind, and it was absolutely you. So I'm glad that you were up for this, and yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you. All right,
Excellent. All right, everybody. Thank you so much. That's all we have for this evening. We'll have other games and stuff that come up later on in the month. I think there's a Halo one shot next Friday, but also next Wednesday, the campaign that I have been talking about, that is set in Baroque France, Spain, Venice. It is called Evermore La Masquerade. It will kick off with its session 0 this coming Wednesday. I'm very excited for that game to finally get started. It's been on the burner for a long time. I may have overcooked it. We'll see. But until then, may your dice roll high and your snacks always be